Confusion is part of the clarity process. Not knowing the answer is part of getting to it. And when I go into the personal branding process with people, and the reason why I do this so differently, that gives them some type of phraseology or articulation that's wildly unique, as I tell them, it's like personal branding is not about just building a digital identity. It's a spiritual commitment to living in truth. It's being in a position of where you can break the chains of being inauthentic because you're not living as your truest and highest self.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to a brand new episode of the None of Your Business podcast. Sean and Lacey with you, just as we are each and every week. And like most weeks, some weeks it's just you and I.
Some weeks.
This week we have a super special guest with us. And this is going to be great because I'm sure that so many people will relate to this individual story. So many of us, when we're just kind of trying to figure out what we're going to do. And that could be people even later in your business career. You pick something, you're like, yeah. And oftentimes we just pick it. And I'm not saying that this is what our guest did, but oftentimes you just pick it because other people were doing it. Oh, you should sell ice cream. You should do
told
this.
You should do it.
Yeah,
right?
maybe you were told. Maybe
like,
we've had people say their parents told them,
right,
you should do this or you should do that. And then you get going and you're successful. They're like, it's going well, but something's missing. If that is you, this week's podcast is for you. And if that's not you, this week's podcast is so that that does not become you.
Right.
It's going to be super valuable. This week's guest is Nick Cavuoto. Nick, welcome to the None of Your Business podcast.
Thank you. I'm so pumped to be here. So appreciate you, Sean and Lacey. This means so much. And I'm excited to just express a rich deposit to your community. So thank you.
We're excited to have you.
So we begin every single None of Your Business podcast with the exact same question. And when we hear your story is going to be very important for everything that we talk about. But the reason we ask this question is because a lot of times people might look at a guest, see your personal branding, see you on social media, say, man, Nick's got it all together. So of course he's telling me about all this stuff. And of course that's easy for him to say because, you have it all together and it just comes natural to you. And what we've learned is that's rarely the case, that somebody's come on and been like, yeah, my dad, handed me everything and I just do this naturally. Tell us a little bit about your creation story and how you end up here.
Yeah, man. Well, my dad was a drug dealer who found Jesus. And that's the origination of my story because it happened a short time before I was born. And so my life has always been about transformation. It's always been about embracing the stories and the life lessons learned when starting something new or restructuring, retooling the things that you want in your life and just rediscovering what the future looks like. So in business, I was in ministry from the time I was 19 until I was 26 and grew a church from 1,000 to 10,000 people every weekend. And then I started cutting my teeth in entrepreneurship and learned a lot of really incredible yet difficult lessons. And I made everything from losing $1 million in 2 days, from having a business partner steal $2 million from me. I mean, the list goes on. And I think that at the central point when it comes to entrepreneurship, but also to spirituality, I truly believe in the bottom of my heart, and some may have heard this statement before, but I think God taps on the shoulder of people who he qualifies based on what he has created them to be versus the things in life, the successes or the failures, whatever it may be, that we might think give us position and opportunity. And so that's really the big idea. We're all here. We all have a unique purpose and defined unique meaning. And I think a lot of us are on the quest to figure out exactly what that is.
You can't just say, oh yeah, that time I lost $1 million in 2 days. How did you lose $1 million in 2 days?
Dude, that was brutal. Life lesson, big life lesson. It was actually right after COVID. The first 48 hours in COVID, I was actually working with elective practitioners at that time. And if you recall, there was that 90-day timeline. First, it was 14 days to flatten the curve. And then it was like 90 days where, elected practitioners can practice. And so, went from doing over $1 million a year to zero, and had to ask God for a miracle. And I think that's where the best things happen in life, when we're able to open our hands and say, God, do what only you can do. And when we take the challenges that happen and we give them to the proper source that can only do what, in my opinion, he can do. I think sovereignty, or I think spirituality rather, was created to end suffering. And so I know what I do when I hit rock bottom. And that's, I turn to the one who started this whole thing and I say, I need your help. So the principle of asking for help is not just from your peers or your loved ones. It's also to the infinite source that can give you more than you could ever imagine. And by placing life's challenges and obstacles into the hand that has the ability to turn them around.
It's such a phenomenal story. And I think there's so many people that go through life and like Sean was saying at the very, very beginning, like experience this level of success, and they're doing things and they're going through the motions, and yet they still feel like this resistive force and they're not exactly sure what it is. I mean, some of the most successful people that we have met, you could tell, and they've talked about that something is missing. And it's amazing that people can reach these levels and still feel that way. And I know that that's something you talk a lot about. So why don't you expand on that? Because I know there's people out there that feel it and they can't necessarily pinpoint what that is.
Well, when people ask me, Nick, what do you do? I often say, well, a lot of things, because if you knew the prison that you're put in the moment that you say, I do this one thing, a lot of us think that it's proper positioning, but in my opinion, it's a prison, because then everyone defines you as that one thing. I'm a maverick. I'm unbrandable, Right. And so when I'm trying to I spend a lot of time in my life trying to find that one thing. How can I find that one thing, that one problem I'm trying to solve, or that one thing that I want to be known for? And I remember my dad, who ended up being a preacher, right? So he told me very simply, he said, Nick, you're an oracle for God. Open your mouth. That changed the game for me. And sometimes we have to borrow the belief of someone else when we're in a season of confusion and suffering and feeling like we're getting crushed by life circumstances. And my dad has been that consistently in my life. And I learned, when people ask me, Nick, what do you do? Which was like that one puzzle piece. Oh, that's a great puzzle. You're missing one piece. It's 10,000 pieces, but you're missing one. How frustrating when you are very aware that that one piece is missing and someone walks by and misses the masterpiece because of one missing piece. I know that in my life, I serve people who have a prayer list that's full of things that God doesn't do. God is a creator. It's like with Noah, God gave him the trees, but he didn't build them. In our lives as people, I think that God has uniquely positioned us with other people, because that's the purpose of humanity, is to help one another. For some reason, and I openly embrace this, God gave me the ability to find and help people find their uniqueness. And in 10 minutes, I can help anybody. It doesn't matter who that person is. In 10 minutes, I can help somebody pinpoint exactly the number one problem that they're solving in the world. And I've done it without God hundreds of times, yet to be stumped. And in the process of doing that, it unlocks the greatest contribution. So if there is someone who's sitting in a position right now where they're like, I don't know what I'm here to do, to me, that's the greatest tragedy. Because each and every one of us is called for a unique purpose. For such a time as this, that we chose to be here, we all have a unique purpose. We all have a place of unique contribution. And I'm just here to grab, the jumper cables of life and reattach it to a heart that needs resuscitating.
I have to say that kind of struck a chord with me, this idea of people putting themselves in this prison by creating this massive limitation by saying, I only do this one thing and I identify as this one thing, and you should identify me as this one thing. I never thought of it that way. And it's really interesting because I've been thinking a lot about this concept of the ability, you have this ability to reinvent yourself. But if I say I only do this one thing and that's how you should see me, I literally take away my power to reinvent myself in any moment. And that's a hard place to be in. And I'm sure that that's what there's people out there right now that have reached that level of success, and they don't even know that they have the opportunity to reinvent and re-engage and emerge into the world as somebody new or doing something different. So I love that you talk about that.
If only everyone understood, the chaos of trying to figure out what is that one thing, or what are the multiple things, or how am I going to figure out how to say this in one statement or one sentence. I wish that people understood how much chaos and success were like neighbors and not separating apart.
Right.
Confusion is part of the clarity process. Not knowing the answer is part of getting to it. And when I go into the personal branding process with people, and the reason why I do this so differently, that gives them some type of phraseology or articulation that's wildly unique, as I tell them, it's like personal branding is not about just building a digital identity. It's a spiritual commitment to living in truth. It's being in a position of where you can break the chains of being inauthentic because you're not living as your truest and highest self. And when that happens, and in the process of discovering the uniqueness of who you are, I always say the best way to do this, if you're really confused, is say, I do a lot of things. Let me tell you about the people that I serve. That's the number one hack. I didn't get to the position of when people ask me, Nick, what do you do? I'm like, I'm a hope dealer and a dope healer. That's what I do. That came out of the abundance, the overflow of the expression of me learning about who I am. And then they're like, well, what does that mean? And then I can go into the conversation. I'm like, are you right-brained or left-brained? If you're left-brained, I'll tell you about what I can do for you as a consultant, help you hit your goals. If you're right-brained, I'm going to have a completely different conversation with you about finding your uniqueness, because everybody is very different. And so those things come as a process of understanding. But my encouragement to you, even on this path, right, is to just remove the labels. That's true freedom. Liberation can come through this process by dissecting your uniqueness, by just uncovering, I think, like the true highest version of you.
Well, you are an expert at personal brand, yet you said you are unbrandable, and you don't. And
that's the brand, though, technically.
Well, and then
the unbrandable brand,
right? And
Exactly.
We don't want to pigeonhole. We don't want, right? And so, talk to us a little bit about that. How do we come up with our personal brand? Because those seem to be two conflicting ideas, right? I can help you to get your personal brand, but I don't want you to pigeonhole yourself. Help us to reconcile those things so that we can have an authentic personal brand without pigeonholing ourselves.
Yes. So the way I like to do this with people is I use the process and a tool or modality that's called human design. And so think of Enneagram meets DISC meets quantum physics and, Eastern philosophy. It's a combination of all these different scientific systems that gives me the ability to start pinpointing some aspects around an individual. Now, there's 64 different archetypes in this model. And then you have if you focus on, your personality, the message, that you have to the world, the direction in life that you're moving, what stabilizes and grounds you, 64 times 64 times 64 times 64. There's like over 1 million different combinations of this. So what my goal is to grab a giant flashlight and to essentially point that into the abyss where someone is confused, they're conflicted, they're feeling crushed, they're just truly trying to find their unique contribution in the world. And I can show them with such pinpoint accuracy the confirmation bias of the things in their life that are already true. And that helps get them way closer. Through that process of definition, we can actually inspect the life trauma that you are here on a DNA level. We can actually see what you're here to cure, the problem that you're here to cure. Mine is suppression. What breaks my heart is people who are censoring and muting themselves, who are damaged by disappointment, who are crushed by life circumstances, but want to make a unique contribution. Those who have been pummeled by the challenges of life, those who have been riveted by maybe, lost revenue or a trash reputation based on an accident they made one time in their life, whatever it may be. But in this energetic testing, what we can do is we can start compiling all the mysteries, and then we can start identifying the common thread. On a vocation level, and I can tell you all this based on what I'm here to do. On a vocation level, it's the eternal child. It's to bring, play to the process of chaos and and driving it into order in the beginning of something new. I'm a master of the creative mess. That's why I would say the miracle's in the middle. It's in the process of finding out who you are. And these are a lot of things that I've derived from my human design. And so I take people through this process and I walk them through it step by step, from their unique genius to their life's purpose. It's an incredible, I would actually love to do it with y'all one time and just show you. It's an experience to be had versus a story to tell.
Yeah, I love that. I'm definitely into that for sure. I want to expand a little bit too on this idea of chaos, because I think that a lot of people feel like they're living in the midst of chaos. And every time you keep saying that, I mean, I keep thinking there's so much universal order in chaos, but we're not capable of seeing it in the moments that we're living in it, right? So how do you help people begin to move themselves out of that, or recognize that, like you said, it's that messy middle, but the most miraculous middle, the powerful component? Like, what words of encouragement can you give people when they're living in it and they can't see that universal order?
I think chaos is the catalyst. That's the first thing. I mentioned it earlier that chaos is the backdrop to success. And so I think the challenge is whatever opposing force that exists in our life, it can't actually stop us. So it just tries to get us to quit. And that's where most people are at. They're like, I have tried so hard and I've showed up over and over and over again. I've done all the right things in my life. And I've listened to Abraham Hicks and I've read the Secret and I've tried to, right? I've read the Bible 47 times and they're paralyzed by the challenges that they're facing. The chaos of confusion, the cloud of confusion that sits over them is the same one that sat above the Israelites when they were going out of a place of bondage and slavery into the promise of who they were as a people to be. And that's what I do. I lead people through there. And they're like, well, where are we going? I'm like, I don't know. We follow the cloud, right? Like that's how this whole thing goes down. So I would just say to not lose hope, to not quit. It's truly the idea that like not quitting is, I think, like the last lane of defense, while also embodying the emotion behind the thing that you want. This is a really, really important principle. There are events that are going to happen in your life, and maybe you're damaged by disappointment right now, listening to this, going like, I just don't even want to keep going. Let me give you something that's going to free you. There are events that happen in life. And when those events happen in life, most people follow the event by emotion. They experience a deep emotion based on the life event that happened. And what happens in that order is when the event and the emotion are combined, it develops a belief or a frame of how you see the world. And this is what I call the carousel of despair. This is where people get into the place of where they feel like there's no hope and they just start spiraling out of control. And a lot of people live there for their entire lives. And this is for me, what gives me a tremendous amount of hope is to help solve this and cure this in the world. Very simply, you can solve this by when events happen in your life that are challenging, to allow your beliefs to be the grand filter of the beautiful treasured experience of your human emotion. Events, beliefs, emotions. And when you live life that way, just like for me, 8 weeks ago when my kids were in school shooting, I did not allow my emotion to be the transit point after that life event. But what I actually allowed to have happen in my heart was to say, number one, what's the first thing on my list of beliefs? That God is for me. Number two, that people are placed to be pillars in my life. I felt not only protected and promoted, as our friend David says, but I felt stable, safe, and secure knowing that my Creator has my back and that the people around me are here to support life's greatest moments of hardship, whether it's financial, emotional, whether it's a threat to safety, whatever it may be. I think that's a primary pillar of what people can start inspecting in their life is when the events of your life happen, does your emotion follow? And if it does, my encouragement is to write down the things right now, the top 10 things that you believe that are true. When we omit the feeling, I feel, that's what we'll say, I feel this way, I feel that way, I feel this way, I feel that way. And typically it's a trauma cycle. So I encourage people to say, I think I choose or I believe. When you say, I think that people are for me, I am choosing to believe that God is on my side. all of a sudden things start to shift. They start to create a different level of awareness that allows you to prevent the spiral of your circumstance, and I think elevate your perspective to a different level.
I think that a lot of people are listening and can benefit greatly by working with Nick. I will offer a perspective because I remember a time when we were in Buck Island and Nick mentioned David Meltzer, and he was using a term that was, in my opinion, he was using it incorrectly.
Right.
Because he was talking about adherence. He used to talk a lot about adherence, adhering to gratitude was a difficult thing. And I told him, I said, I think you're using that term incorrectly because adhering is two dissimilar things being stuck together. What I think you're trying to say is coherence because it's two similar things. And he began to use that word. But you and Nick both spoke about chaos. And Nick clearly has a strong spiritual side. And this idea of chaos, and if we were to just be very analytical, scientific about it, the concept of entropy, that says that things tend to move towards a state of chaos or disorder. Right. But you can't actually subscribe to this if you hold the spiritual beliefs that Nick is espousing. Because how could things be tending to move away from the state of order of the creator? That doesn't make any sense. That means that the creator actually, at the end of the day, doesn't have control, ultimate control, that things tend to just run away from the creator, right? Mm-hmm. My argument is that when we say entropy, the example we give is if we throw a plate on the floor, that it just breaks into random pieces. See how it just breaks into chaos. That's an example. It went from order and form to chaos. My argument is, oh no, everything about that happened is predictable.
Right.
It depends on the composition of the plate, the velocity, the composition of the floor, the angle that it hit. It is all very calculatable. We just don't have that capacity in our minds to understand it. Therefore, we label it as chaos. So, and in this case, I think that when we're talking about people who are feeling like they're in a state of chaos, maybe that might be helpful to say to yourself, well, it's like everything else. Nothing is tending towards disorder. And chaos. Mm-hmm. Everything is calculatable by, if you believe in the creator, the higher universal intelligence, whatever you want to call it. But I just don't understand it.
Right.
Therefore, my view at this moment is that it's chaotic.
It's predictable, but not within my realm of understanding.
Right. But that's helpful because if I understood that, then I would be like, well, it's not, my life isn't tending towards disorder. Things aren't off the rails. I hear that a lot. It's off the rails. Right. There's not off the rails. It's actually, what's interesting is it's going exactly according to plan, but you are just not able to comprehend the plan. And so that's when then you talk about sovereignty. Then you're like, all right, so do I have the discipline? Can I obey? Do I have the humility to say, well, this is just going to the plan. I just don't know what the plan is. And then we're back into, those concepts. Do I actually believe that the higher order, loves me more than my mother loves me, cares about me, and would I be put in a plan that was for my own detriment or for my own good, right? And so everything is going exactly as the plan. We just can't figure it out. And I think that drives us nuts because everything we want to figure out.
And oftentimes it's just that kind of perspective shift that's necessary to take you out of the pure emotion of the perceived chaos to allow the process, the predictability to actually unfold so that you can live in the miracle, right? And so I think that that's important.
So the next question, Nick's not going to like because he's super positive. He's a super positive guy. He's like, he's kept this on the super positive. But I'm going to ask the negative because I think it will be helpful. Like you are very big on alignment. And so I want to know for the listeners and the viewers, how would someone know? Because we've talked about this a lot with a lot of our guests that help people. A lot of people have a problem, but they're not aware of it. Right? They're in your shoes right before your awareness. Let's talk to them. What are some signs? Give us some signs. Give us some clues for everybody who's like, Nick's great, but I don't need him. Right? Like if you're a chiropractor, you've heard that before. I hope I never need a chiropractor.
You're living out of alignment. You don't even know.
I love this guy, Nick. I hope I never need him.
Yeah.
But How would somebody know that they're out of alignment? Some subtle hints. I mean, not that they're, doing drugs at 12 o'clock and hiding it from their family. What are some of the other subtle, hints that they might not be stepping in alignment in their life?
Yeah, it's funny that you asked me that, because I was just thinking about this earlier and I wrote this down. I'll give you a formula. When we're in a mode of suppression, whether aware or unaware, typically we have an increased level of confusion and an increased level of things that are uncontrollable, or as we call it, chaos. Suppression, leads to an increase in stress. And this happens both practically, like you're experiencing things that are maybe external stressors. It happens also in the frame of physiologically when people start experiencing stress. So you might start noticing, am I even breathing? I've been shallow breathing, or you're feeling this increased level of anxiety. So typically the stress conditions happen through an increased level of fear, an increased level of uncertainty, a decrease of perceived control of your circumstances or situations, and a decrease in clarity. So you're kind of losing balance. Like life is feeling out of balance. You're feeling like, why are things not maybe working the way that I thought they would? Why are these random challenges or deep challenges happening in my life? How come I keep arriving to the same life lesson over and over and over again? And it feels like I have to keep retaking the test. That starts producing a deeper level of stress in our lives. And then the third S is separation. And separation is when we take on our perspective as, why are all these things happening to me, versus God's perspective of, I'm placing obstacles in your path so that you can learn how to overcome them. And I think when we go into that layer of holding our perspective of separateness, that's when sickness comes. And sickness is an indicator to bring you back to the place of suppression, because the number one thing that causes, in my opinion, the number one thing that causes illness for entrepreneurs is suppression of their authentic self. That's why I got into personal branding, was because I saw too many people hitting the road of failure when they're trying to start something new, getting to a place of burnout and isolation, going like, my life cannot go down this way. They were so passionate about solving the world's problems, or choosing one thing that they want to stick their flag into and say, this is why I'm uniquely called to be here. But when we're suppressed, we become stressed. When we're suppressed and stressed, we feel separate from God. When we're suppressed, stressed, and separate, that's when we experience sickness in our lives. And the key indicator is to bring us back around to the level of awareness. I tell everybody this, Sean and Lacey, same thing. I tell everybody this, very, very simple. I am not here to convince anyone of anything. That is my life. It's so funny being in marketing for all these incredible things for some of the biggest companies in the world in branding and marketing. But what I realize in my own life is, when you get to the convinced stage, that's where I go to the divine stage. When people come to me, they're highly intuitive, highly sensitive, highly empathetic, and they tell me, I feel like I'm supposed to work with you. That's my indicator. I'm actually in sometimes a holding pattern for consciousness to get to a place of where the gift that I have to give, based on the life lessons that I've learned, has to match the frequency of the individual who's like, it's time. This happens to me all the time. They're the best clients, the most aligned. I wait for the invitation. It's my life strategy is to wait for the invitation. But I cannot hide in the process of doing that. And that's my encouragement to those who are on the negative side of this, maybe experiencing the challenge. You are likely in a place of hiding. There's a hero within you, but you're a hidden hero right now, like Gideon on the threshing floor, who had to get 300 men and go against a massive army and count, geez, I hope God's on my side in this situation. And so that's what I look at, a place of hiding, a place of beauty, a place of like not posturing yourself to the potential that you know that you're called to leverage in the world. And that's the illness. That's, am I aware? Are you living up to the potential that God has put in you? And if you cannot answer that question with 100% certainty, give me 1 hour to define something unique for you that you can go all in on. And I think that that's where champions and heroes are born.
Well, I think that's a very compelling call to action for all of our viewers and listeners. How do people find out more about you? Where do they find you? I would say it. We're going to put the link in the show notes, but I actually want to see how Nick handles it. How do How do people get a hold of you, Nick?
Yeah, I'll make it simple. My website's nickcavuoto.com. If you don't want to look at the show notes or try to figure out how to spell it, on Instagram, you can look me up, Nick Cavuoto, or you can text me 303-249-5002. Call me, text me. It's the easiest way to do it. And yeah, you'll know. I work with intuitives. So if you're listening and you just know, I probably just should have a conversation with this guy, then do it. Yeah. It's so simple. You have nothing to lose. Yeah.
Absolutely love it. Nick, you crushed it. So valuable.
We could talk forever.
I know that Lacey loved it because I'm an intuitive. I can pick it up, and I know that you loved it. Please reach out to Nick, nickcavuoto.com. Shoot him a text. Just rewind the podcast if you missed that number. I love that. Here's an interesting thing too. We talk about this. I love guests that give out their email or their phone number. And our guests don't have like some automated thing, like giving out some like bogus number, and you're trapped in this, spammy text system. Like people give their actual phone numbers because they have a desire to connect. But you know what happens is people don't really understand the value of that for a guest to come on a podcast, he doesn't know what we're going to do with the podcast. We can put the podcast wherever we want, and then people reach out. So the reason why he said his phone number is so that people would reach out. But here's what happens. You got that number. A lot of you wrote it down. You put it in your phone, and then you're like, I don't want to bother Nick. And that is the biggest mistake ever, right? Because if you felt that, like, hey, I need to reach out to Nick, but then you override it. But you override it. You're like, oh, I don't want to bother. You have an excuse. You have a story that you tell yourself about why you're not going to do it. And then you eventually don't do it. Like, how many people have my cell phone number in their phones but don't ever reach out, right? Then they tell me later on, like, oh, I meant to text, or I should have reached out, or I should have come to Black Diamond Club. Listen, the whole thing about this is following that inner voice, right? That's that first step. If you have the 10,000 piece puzzle and you're missing the one piece, but you won't listen to that voice that's bringing you to that piece, well, that's on you. Yep. That's like sitting there and you're praying for a job, but you haven't applied to any, and you're like, well, the job should come to me. That's not how it works, right? You gotta get up. I always tell people this all the time. Our listeners have heard this 9 million times. I've never seen anybody's life change or transform just listening to a podcast. We do a podcast and we think it's transformative, but you got to do stuff. So this is your invitation to reach out and call Nick Cavuoto. If you feel called, I'm sure it's for a reason. Thanks, Nick, for joining us. You were an absolute tremendous guest. You said it all today and you touched lives.
Thank you, man. Appreciate y'all so much. Thank you again. Appreciate it.
All right, everybody, we're going to have to work double hard next week to top this one. We'll give it a go. Be sure you come back and tune in next week for a brand new edition of the None of Your Business podcast.